Today we're going to be talking about the different types of weathering and the different things that can affect how fast weathering occurs. We're going to be doing these notes in a mind map or a concept map. And so I have a blank page and mine is turned landscape because that's the way my board goes. If you want to do yours portrait, that is up to you. I'm going to be starting with my title just off of top center. And we're talking about weathering, so that's going to be my title today. And we should put a short definition for what weathering is with our title. Weathering is the breaking down of rocks in place. Why do we need that part that says in place? Well, because later we're going to talk about erosion. Erosion is the process of those pieces being taken somewhere else. Weathering doesn't talk about that. Weathering simply discusses or goes over the process of the breaking down. So here's our starting place. What is weathering? There are two different types of weathering. So we'll put those off to each side. The first one is called mechanical. Mechanical weathering does not change the rock's composition. What does that mean? Composition means what it's made of. So mechanical weathering processes simply break the rock down into smaller pieces. They do not change what it's made of. There are two main agents of mechanical weathering. Two main things that can cause mechanical weathering. One of them, we're going to try to squeeze in up top here, and that is temperature. Changes in temperature can cause mechanical weathering. There are two ways that temperature can cause mechanical weathering. Just like most objects, rocks will expand when heated and contract or get smaller when they are cooled. And if that happens often enough or over time often enough, then that can cause cracks and breaks in the rock. So they expand when heated and contract when cooled, and over time that can cause the rock to break down. The second thing that the second way temperature can cause mechanical weathering is through a process that we are very familiar with here in Illinois called frost wedging. Frost wedging occurs when water freezes and expands, because water is just about the only thing that expands when it freezes. And that causes cracks in the rock. Just like expanding frozen water can cause cracks in your pipes in the winter, make a big mess. Water can seep into cracks in the rock that are already there, freeze, make those cracks bigger, and over time it can break that rock apart. So temperature can cause weathering by expansion when it's heated and contracting when it's cooled, or by having water getting into those cracks and freezing and expanding and then breaking the rock that way. The second thing that can cause mechanical weathering is pressure. there are 3 ways that pressure can cause mechanical weathering. 2 of them have to do with plants and animals. Plants can cause pressure that can cause weathering because tree roots especially can push into cracks in the rock and make those cracks wider. And eventually it would break the rock. Just like a tree root that's growing under a sidewalk and it pushes the concrete up and eventually breaks the concrete, roots can do that with natural rocks as well. The other one has to do with animals. Might seem like a minor idea, but animals can burrow into the ground, and as they create that burrow, they can crack rocks. Probably not very big ones, but it's still a form of weathering. The third one has to do with movement of large sections of rock. Put that one down here. And that is called pressure unloading. Pressure unloading occurs when there are layers of rock on top of others, and those top layers are suddenly removed. When the top layers are suddenly removed. That could be due to something like an earthquake, it could be man-made, maybe an excavation of some kind, but if the rock way underneath is under a ton of pressure from the rocks above it, and then you suddenly remove the rocks above it, that can cause the rock underneath to have so much pressure relieved that it would actually crack. Kind of very similar to when you open a pop bottle after it's been shaken up. You release the pressure and you get a very strong reaction to that release. Okay, on the other side, let's put the other kind of weathering, which is chemical. Chemical weathering is the kind that does change the rock's composition. That means it changes what the rock was made of in some way. In your book, it talks about the example of the statue or the monument, Cleopatra's Needle, and how it was made of a type of rock that's susceptible to chemical weathering, and it's being worn away over time by different agents of chemical weathering. There are 4 agents of chemical weathering. We're going to try to squish them in here as best we can. The first one that we'll mention is one that we've probably all heard the term for before, and that is acid rain. Acid rain is responsible for lots of different things, but it can, among other things, kill trees and fish. On an interesting side note about the acid rain, it kills the trees and the fish, partially because fish breathe through their gills, and there are different minerals in the water that are normally not soluble. That means they don't dissolve under neutral water conditions, but when you make the water acidic, they do dissolve, and then those minerals will precipitate out in the fish's gills. We talked about precipitation last time, and they become kind of a solid in the fish gills, and then the fish actually suffocate. Acid rain is a huge problem in the Northeast United States because their bedrock there, meaning the rock that's underground or their solid layer under all of their lakes, their bedrock is granite. And granite does not react with acid, so the acid just builds up and builds up in the lake until it kills the fish. Here in the Midwest, we don't have as much trouble with acid rain, not because we're not getting it, but because our lakes are on top of a layer of limestone. Our bedrock here is mostly limestone, and we know that limestone reacts with acid. It's essentially the same thing that they put in Tums. So if our lakes' bottoms react with acid and neutralize the acid, then we don't get as much trouble with fish dying because of acid rain. But anyway, how can acid rain break down rocks? Well, it has to do with what they react with. Acid rain will eat away at limestone. It will eat away at marble, which is a metamorphic rock we'll talk about next time. But eventually, enough acid rain would wear away to the point that that rock would completely break down. If you have ever visited a cemetery and you notice that there's usually 2 different kinds or 3 different kinds of rocks used for headstones, there's white ones, which are usually marble. There's gray ones, which are probably limestone. And then current ones are kind of a multitude of colors. And that's because most current ones, or many current ones, are made out of granite. Granite doesn't react with acid. Granite doesn't have problems with acid rain. The older ones, made out of marble and limestone, a lot of them are getting very difficult to read because over time we've had enough acid rain that it's worn down the letters on those gravestones and they can no longer be read. Okay, next agent of chemical weathering is oxygen. And we'll just put an O because that's the symbol for oxygen. How can oxygen cause chemical weathering? Well, again, something we know very well here in Illinois because we have cars that are made out of iron, and when you take oxygen and put it with iron, throw in a little salt sometimes to make things go faster from our winter roads, and you get lots of rust. Let's make this an O2. So oxygen plus iron makes rust. Rocks can rust, just like your car can rust. And in fact, any rock that contains the mineral hematite, which is one of the ones that you saw in your mineral lab, is a rock that can rust. And if it rusts enough, it will just crumble away, just like the rust on a car would crumble away. 2 more agents of chemical weathering. One of them, H2O, seems pretty harmless at first until you realize that water can actually cause a chemical reaction with some minerals. Not very many minerals, but some. So it reacts with minerals, and that can break them down, which would break down the rock. This is the process by which the mineral feldspar, if you had the pink mineral for the mineral quiz, you had feldspar. Feldspar will actually turn into clay over a long period of time in the water because of a chemical reaction with the water. Water can also dissolve some minerals. You might be able to think of one that it can dissolve. It was the one that tasted salty from your mineral lab. And that was halite. Probably you know that salt dissolves in water. You just hadn't thought about it in terms of chemical weathering before. One more agent of chemical weathering, and it is another compound, and that is carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide can cause chemical weathering by mixing with water. If you mix carbon dioxide with water, you actually produce an acid. It's called carbonic acid. And of course, as we already talked about, acid reacts with limestone. So anything that's made of calcite, limestone, or as we mentioned, marble, a metamorphic rock we'll talk about next week. Anything that reacts, or anything that's made of calcite, limestone, or marble would react with carbonic acid. Now, this is not necessarily the acid that's mostly responsible for acid rain. I believe that's a sulfur acid. This one occurs naturally because there's naturally carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, and there's naturally water vapor in our atmosphere. So if you have those two things, enough of them together, carbonic acid will occur completely naturally. And this is the process that makes limestone caves, like Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. So all of those caves that have been carved out, especially around the Midwest region, that would have been through a process of carbonic acid eating away at the limestone bedrock. Okay, we've got one more thing to try to squish in the middle here. And those are the factors that can affect how fast weathering takes place. So right here in the middle, we are going to put rate factors. There are three things that can make weathering change how fast it goes, and in general we'll talk about things that can speed it up or make it faster. One of those would be to increase surface area. If you crumble up a rock into smaller pieces, you are increasing its surface area. You are increasing the amount of that rock that is exposed to weathering. Rather than having a big chunk where the only part that's exposed is the outside, if you powder it up, all of it's exposed, that weathering is going to go much faster. The second one has to do with what minerals the rock is made of. We've kind of talked about this already. Some minerals resist weathering more than others. So some minerals are going to weather less, some of them will weather more. Depending on what the rock is made of, that helps determine how fast it will break down. And then our third one, see if we can drop it down right here, is the climate that those rocks are in. For mechanical weathering, and I'll abbreviate that, for mechanical weathering, a climate that would make weathering go faster would be a cool and wet climate, because you would have more frost wedging, and yet you'd still have all the things as far as expanding when heated and contracting when cooled. You'd have more water and more temperature changes. If you're talking about chemical weathering, then the climate that would make that go faster would be a warm and wet climate. Generally because chemical reactions go faster at higher temperatures. And of course added water there, where water is an agent of chemical weathering, that would certainly help that speed up as well. All right, I think we are all finished. Hopefully yours is a little less crowded than mine. And next, we will talk about erosion.